sir, you fell asleep.
6 years, and you're the first person who made the noise stop.
6 years. That's how long Dominic's brain had been eating itself. 6 years of micro-naps, chemical blackouts, and the persistent taste of copper. He ruled the city's underground, yet a simple REM cycle was his white whale. Then, a woman smelling of cheap soap walked in and broke the noise. Dominic Falco did not sleep. He powered down, occasionally, like a faulty engine that stalled in traffic, only to violently sputter back to life seconds later. It had been 6 years since he last closed his eyes and actually fell into the dark. 6 years since his father's car was blown to scrap metal on the interstate, leaving Dominic with a fractured empire, a web of paranoid loyalties, and a brain that refused to shut off. The physical toll was a slow, agonizing rot. The back of his neck constantly felt like it was strung with piano wire, pulled so tight it vibrated. His eyelids were lined with grit, a dry, scraping sensation every time he blinked. He lived in a state of permanent jet lag, his blood thick and sluggish, his thoughts a chaotic hum of radio static. When you don't sleep, the world loses its edges. Colors bleed. Shadows in the corners of rooms detach themselves from the walls and crawl. He knew they weren't real, but knowing didn't stop his hand from drifting to the cold steel of the Sig Sauer tucked into his waistband every time a coat rack looked too much like a man. It was Tuesday, 3:00 a.m. Dominic sat in his office at the center of his heavily fortified estate. The room was a massive, oppressive cavern of dark oak, smelling faintly of stale cigar smoke, expensive leather, and the sour tang of his own exhaustion. The silence of the house wasn't actually silent. It was a cacophony of micro-sounds that his hyper-vigilant brain amplified into sirens. The HVAC unit hummed a low, droning times. Thrum, thrum, thrum. A grandfather clock in the hallway ticked with the blunt force of a hammer hitting an anvil. Downstairs, a guard shifted his weight, the leather of his boots creaking. Dominic rubbed his face, his heavy stubble scratching against his palms. He had tried everything. Ambien, melatonin, imported sedatives that could drop a horse, dark rooms, sensory deprivation tanks, white noise machines. The pills just trapped him in a state of sleep paralysis. His body chemically locked down while his mind screamed in the dark, entirely awake, watching the shadows crawl. He preferred the exhaustion to the paralysis. A sharp knock broke his spiraling thoughts. Tommy, his second in command, stepped in. Tommy always looked slightly alarmed when he looked at Dominic these days, though he tried to hide it. Dominic knew what he looked like, hollowed out, skin the color of old parchment, eyes sunken into dark, bruised pits. "The shipment from the port cleared," Tommy said, his voice dropping into the quiet of the room. "Bennett is holding the trucks at the warehouse until you give the word. Tell him to move them at dawn," Dominic rasped. His throat felt like cracked mud. He reached for his glass of water. It was lukewarm, tasting faintly of the dust in the air. "You got it, boss." Tommy hesitated, shifting his weight. You want me to call the doctor back? Have him try a new script? Get out, Tommy." It wasn't a yell. It was barely a whisper, flat and dead. But Tommy backed out of the room immediately, pulling the heavy door shut until the brass latch clicked. Dominic leaned his head back against the leather chair, staring at the ceiling. The plaster had a swirl pattern. If he stared long enough, the swirls spun. The next morning, the house was a hive of controlled, anxious activity. The estate employed 30 people guards, chefs, drivers, groundskeepers, and maids. Dominic hated all of them. He hated the noise they made, the oxygen they took up, the nervous energy they leaked into the air whenever he walked past. They treated him like a bomb with a faulty timer, and their fear only made him more irritable. He was in the first-floor dining room, forcing down a piece of dry toast and a mug of black coffee that tasted like battery acid when he first noticed her. She wasn't trying to be noticed. In fact, her entire existence seemed designed around blending into the baseboards. She was one of the new cleaning staff, wearing the standard gray uniform that swallowed her shape. Her hair, a dull, unremarkable brown, was pulled back into a severe, utilitarian knot at the base of her skull. Dominic watched her over the rim of his coffee mug. She was wiping down the massive, ornate dining table, working her way toward his end. Usually, when the staff had to clean near him, their breathing went shallow, their hands shook. They moved with jerky, frantic motions, desperate to finish and get out of his sight. This woman didn't. She moved with a heavy, steady rhythm. Wipe, fold the cloth, wipe, step, wipe. There was no hesitation, but there was no rush, either. She was breathing through her nose, slow and even. As she got closer, Dominic caught a whiff of her. There was no heavy perfume, no sweet floral scent. She smelled like cheap, unscented glycerin soap, the faint, chemical bite of glass cleaner, and something else, something damp and cool, like the smell of a sidewalk right after it rains. She reached his side of the table. She didn't look at his face. Her eyes, a flat, tired gray, stayed fixed on the mahogany surface. "Excuse me," she said. Her voice wasn't high or timid. It was slightly raspy, grounded, completely devoid of inflection. Dominic didn't move. He just stared at her, waiting for the inevitable crack in her composure, waiting for her to realize who she was talking to and start stammering apologies. She didn't. She just stood there, holding the damp cloth, looking at the space on the table where his elbow was resting. She wasn't challenging him. She just wanted to clean the wood and move on to the next room. The complete absence of fear or reverence in her posture was so jarring it short-circuited his irritation. Slowly, Dominic lifted his arm. She wiped the spot, folded the cloth, and moved down the line. She didn't say thank you. She didn't scurry away. She just kept the rhythm. Wipe, step, wipe. Dominic watched her disappear into the hallway. For the first time in 6 years, the relentless buzzing at the base of his skull quieted down to a low hum. Her name was Clara Higgins. She was 28, drowning in debt, left behind by a brother who thought he could outsmart the local bookies. And she had taken this job because the pay was absurdly high for someone whose only qualification was a willingness to scrub floors. She knew who owned the house. She just didn't care. When you were working 2 jobs and surviving on 4 hours of sleep and cold soup, the Mafia is just another rich employer with dirty floors. Dominic didn't look into her background right away. He didn't care who she was. But over the next week, he found himself tracking her movements through the sprawling house. It wasn't a conscious stalking. It was instinctual, like a man freezing to death, inching toward a draft of warm air. The estate was full of sharp edges, men with guns, men with ambitions, men with fear. Clara was a blunt object. She absorbed sound rather than creating it. It happened on a Thursday afternoon. The morning had been a disaster. A sit-down with the Southside faction had gone sideways. There had been shouting, a shattered glass, and a brief, ugly moment of violence that left Dominic's knuckles bruised and aching. His adrenaline was spiked, but his body was completely hollowed out. The contradiction made him physically nauseous. His vision blurred at the edges, his temples throbbing in time with his erratic heartbeat. He retreated to his private library on the 2nd floor, a room strictly off-limits to everyone except his inner circle. He didn't even turn on the lights. He just collapsed onto the heavy Chesterfield sofa, dropping his gun onto the coffee table with a heavy Times thud. He dug the heels of his hands into his eyes, pressing until sparks bloomed in the darkness. God, he was so tired. It felt like his bones were turning to lead, yet his brain was a frantic, cornered rat, gnawing at the inside of his skull. He heard the soft click of the heavy oak door opening. "Get out!" he snarled, his voice a gravelly threat. He didn't open his eyes. He assumed it was Tommy, or maybe one of the guards checking the perimeter. The door didn't close. Instead, there was the soft, muffled sound of a bucket being set down on the thick Persian rug. Dominic snapped his eyes open, his hand dropping automatically toward the table where his gun lay. Clara was standing just inside the door. She had a duster in one hand and a spray bottle in the other. She looked at him, then at the gun on the table, and then back up to his face. Her expression didn't change. There was no gasp, no widening of the eyes. She just looked mildly inconvenienced. "I have to dust the top shelves. she said, her voice flat. "I can come back in 20 minutes if you're busy." Dominic stared at her. His chest was heaving slightly from the sudden spike of panic, but she was entirely unfazed. The absolute mundanity of her statement clashed violently with the reality of the room. He was a mafia boss, covered in dried blood, sitting in a dark room with a weapon. She was holding a feather duster. "I said, get out," he repeated, though the venom had leached out of his tone, replaced by a strange, heavy confusion. Clara sighed. It wasn't a dramatic sigh. It was the bone-deep sigh of a minimum-wage worker who was being hindered from finishing her shift. "The housekeeper checks my zones at 4. If the shelves aren't done, I get docked. Please just ignore me." Before he could argue, she turned her back on him, dragged a small wooden step stool to the far wall, and began to wipe down the mahogany bookcases. Dominic was too exhausted to yell. He was too exhausted to stand up and physically throw her out. His hand fell away from the gun. He let his head loll back against the leather sofa, watching her through half-closed, stinging eyes. She was about 15 feet away. The library was dim, the heavy velvet curtains drawn against the afternoon sun, leaving only slivers of dusty light cutting across the room. He listened to her. Shh. The soft friction of a cotton cloth over polished wood. Clack. The gentle sound of a book being shifted, dusted, and set back in place. Squeak. Dow. The rubber sole of her canvas. Shoe. Shifting on the wooden step stool. She didn't hum. She didn't sigh again. She just worked. Dominic's breathing, which had been ragged and shallow for hours, subconsciously began to pace itself to her movements. Wipe. Step. Wipe. The smell of lemon oil and old paper drifted across the room, mixing with that faint, clean scent of rain and cheap soap she carried with her. The tight, vibrating wire at the base of his neck loosened, just a fraction. The frantic ticking in his mind slowed. There was no threat here. There was no ambition, no fear, no hidden agenda. There was just a woman dusting books because she needed the money. It was the most honest, uncomplicated thing Dominic had been around in a decade. He closed his eyes, just to rest them, just to block out the slivers of light for 1 second, while he listened to the rhythm of her work. The next thing he knew, he was drowning. He jolted upward, a violent, full-body spasm that threw him off the edge of the sofa. He hit the floor hard, his knee cracking against the coffee table. He scrambled backward, his hand blindly grabbing the heavy metal of the gun, his heart hammering against his ribs like a jackhammer. He leveled the weapon at the room, gasping for air, expecting an ambush, expecting assassins. The room was empty. The dim slivers of sunlight had shifted across the floor, turning long and orange. It was late afternoon. Dominic knelt on the floor, the gun shaking slightly in his grip, his chest heaving. His mouth tasted thick and foul, and there was a damp spot on the leather sofa where his cheek had rested. He touched his face. He had been drooling. His eyes darted to the grandfather clock in the corner of the library. It was 5:15 p.m. He had gone into the library at 3:30. He had slept. Not a micronap, not a chemical blackout. He had genuinely, fully, completely passed out for nearly 2 hours. Dominic lowered the gun, the heavy steel suddenly feeling ridiculous in his hand. He stared at the far wall. The shelves gleamed, free of dust. The step stool was gone. He touched his face again. The agonizing, scraping grit behind his eyelids was gone. The world, for the first time in 6 years, had solid edges. The crippling, suffocating weight in his chest had receded, leaving behind a terrifying, hollow awe. He hadn't felt this alive, this terrifyingly present, since he was a teenager. He stood up, his joints popping, his mind unnervingly clear. He walked over to the bookshelf, running a finger along the polished wood. It smelled faintly of lemon oil. He needed to find her. By the time Dominic summoned her to his office the next morning, the rumor mill among the estate staff was already churning. The boss had demanded a schedule change. The new girl, the quiet one who didn't talk to anyone in the break room, was being reassigned. She was off general rotation. Her only job now was the second floor Dominic's private quarters, his study, his library. Clara stood in front of his massive desk, her hands shoved deep into the pockets of her gray apron. She looked defensive, her jaw set tight. She smelled like bleach this time, her knuckles raw and pink from scrubbing a bathroom down the hall. Dominic sat behind the desk. He felt worse today. The 2 hours of sleep had been a cruel tease. His body, having remembered what rest felt like, was now screaming for more, punishing him for the relapse into insomnia. His head throbbed, and his temper was fraying on a microscopic thread. "I didn't steal anything," Clara said before he could even speak. Her voice was flat, but there was a hard, cynical edge to it. "If something's missing from the library, it wasn't me. You can check my locker. You can check my pockets." Dominic blinked, the dry grit scraping against his corneas. "I didn't say you stole anything." "Then why am I here?" she asked, shifting her weight. The housekeeper said, "I'm off the main floor AI. If you're firing me, just give me my severance and let me go." "I'm not firing you." Dominic leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. He rubbed the bridge of his nose, trying to find the words. How exactly did a man who ordered executions and controlled millions of dollars in illicit trade explain this without sounding entirely insane? "You're being reassigned," he said finally. "You work my floor now, my office, the library, my bedroom." Clara's eyes narrowed. The flat indifference finally cracked, replaced by a sharp, cold disgust. "I clean floors, Mr. Falco. That's all I do. I don't do extra services. If that's what this is, I quit right now." Dominic let out a harsh, rasping laugh that sounded more like a cough. The idea of sex was so far removed from his current biological needs, it was almost funny. "I don't want to sleep with you, Clara." "Then what do you want?" "I just want you to be in the room." She stared at him. The silence stretched, heavy and awkward. "You want me to clean the room while you're in it?" "No," Dominic said, his voice dropping, the desperation leaking through the cold facade. "I want you to just be in the room. You can clean if you want. You can read. You can stare at the wall. I don't care. I just need you to sit there." Clara looked at him like he had just grown a second head. She looked at his hollow, dark eyes, the gray tint of his skin, the slight tremor in his hands. She was a cynical woman, raised in a rough neighborhood, accustomed to the bizarre demands of erratic men. But this was new. "You're a creep," she said bluntly. Dominic didn't flinch. "I haven't slept in 6 years. Not really. I don't know why, and I don't care why. But yesterday, when you were in the library, I fell asleep." He swallowed hard, the vulnerability of the admission tasting like ash in his mouth. He was giving her leverage, a predator showing its underbelly to a prey-class citizen. It went against every survival instinct he possessed. "I will triple your salary. I will pay you in cash, off the books, every Friday. All you have to do is sit in the corner of the room while I try to rest." Clara didn't immediately say no. Dominic saw the calculation in her eyes. He saw the exact moment her disgust was overridden by the math in her head. Tripling her salary meant the bookies would be paid off in 2 months instead of 2 years. It meant she could sleep without checking the locks on her apartment door 3 times a night. "I don't wear anything else," she said, pointing to her bulky gray uniform. "No weird outfits, no talking. And if you try to touch me, I swear to God, I will break a lamp over your head and take my chances with your guards." "Deal," Dominic said, instantly. The first deliberate session was a disaster. They tried it that afternoon in the library. Dominic lay on the sofa, a blanket pulled over his legs, feeling utterly ridiculous. Clara sat in a hard-backed wooden chair in the corner, holding a paperback novel she had pulled from her apron pocket. The tension in the room was suffocating. Dominic's brain was screaming on high alert. "She's watching you. She knows you're weak. She could be a plant. She could have a knife." He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to force the darkness, but his body was rigid, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Every time Clara turned a page, the rustle of the paper sounded like a gunshot. "Stop that," Dominic snapped, sitting up and glaring at her. Clara looked up from her book, her expression deadpan. "Stop what? Reading? You're breathing too loud. You're agitated. It's making me agitated. I'm agitated because I'm sitting in a room with a mafia boss who's throwing a tantrum because he can't take a nap. She shot back, closing the book with a loud snap. This is stupid. You can't force this. I am paying you to. You're paying me to sit here, which I am doing, she interrupted, not backing down. I'm not a magic spell, Mr. Falco. Yesterday, I was just working. I wasn't paying attention to you. You weren't paying attention to me. Today, you're staring at me like I'm a bomb about to go off, and I feel like a hostage. She stood up, shoving the book into her pocket. I'm going to clean the baseboards in the hallway. Leave the door open. If you sleep, you sleep. If you don't, fire me tomorrow. She didn't wait for his permission. She walked out of the library, leaving the heavy door ajar. A moment later, Dominic heard the clatter of a bucket, the slosh of water. He cursed under his breath, rubbing his aching temples. He lay back down on the sofa, furious, exhausted, and feeling entirely pathetic. He stared at the ceiling, waiting for his heart rate to slow down. From the hallway, the sound drifted in. Shh, a scrub brush against the wood, the rhythmic ringing of a sponge, the soft, even sound of Clara exhaling through her nose. As she worked, Dominic closed his eyes. He didn't try to sleep this time. He just focused on the sound, the utter, boring mundanity of a woman scrubbing a floor. There was no threat in it. There was no agenda. It was just labor, steady and grounding. The tight wire in his neck began to loosen. The smell of the harsh chemical soap wafted into the room, cutting through the heavy scent of old books and leather. He didn't remember falling asleep. He only remembered waking up 3 hours later, the library dark, a blanket thrown over his shoulders, and the faint, lingering scent of cheap soap in the air. 2 months into the arrangement, the transformation was undeniable. The hollow, bruised pits under Dominic's eyes had filled in. His skin lost its translucent, waxy sheen, returning to a warm, olive baseline. The paranoid, vibrating energy that used to bleed off him, pushing his men away, was gone. It was replaced by a cold, dense gravity. He was sleeping 5 hours a night. To a normal man, 5 hours was chronic fatigue. To Dominic, it was a resurrection. The routine was strictly utilitarian. At 11 p.m., Clara would enter his bedroom. She never knocked. She just turned the heavy brass handle and walked in. She always wore the same oversized gray uniform, smelling faintly of bleach and that sharp, unscented glycerin soap. She would sit in the wingback chair by the window, turn on a small reading lamp, and pull out a cheap, dog-eared paperback. Dominic would lie in the center of his massive, empty bed, staring at the ceiling until his breathing synced with the rustle of her turning pages. If she left the room to get a glass of water, he woke up instantly, his heart hammering against his ribs until the floorboards creaked with her return. He was entirely dependent on a woman who made $15 an hour. The realization grated on his pride, a low-level irritation he chewed on during his waking hours. He was the head of the Falco syndicate. He controlled politicians, dock workers, and half the narcotics traffic on the eastern seaboard. Yet, his sanity was held hostage by a housekeeper with split ends and a scuff on her left canvas shoe. The friction started on a Tuesday, during a muggy, suffocating heat wave that made the air inside the estate feel like hot soup. Dominic was sitting at his desk, reviewing ledgers. His mind was sharp, slicing through the numbers with a ruthless efficiency he hadn't possessed in years. Clara was wiping down the glass cabinets across the room. "I need Thursday night off," she said. She didn't stop wiping. The squeak of the rag against the glass continued, rhythmic and grating. Dominic's pen stopped mid-stroke. A spike of pure, unadulterated panic hit his chest, hot and fast, followed immediately by a surge of anger. No. Clara dropped the rag into her bucket. The water sloshed loudly in the quiet room. She turned to face him, wiping a strand of dull brown hair off her forehead with the back of a damp wrist. "It wasn't a request, Mr. Falco. It was a notification. I have an errand in the city. I won't be back until Friday morning. I am paying you triple your salary to be available every night." He kept his voice flat, but his fingers gripped the mahogany edge of the desk, hard enough to turn his knuckles white. "And I've been here every night for 8 weeks, Clara fired back, her tone lacking any of the deference his men showed him. "I have a life outside this house, a messy one, but it's mine. I have to go to the bank, and then I have to meet a man about my brother's debt. If I don't show up with the cash, the interest doubles, and they start breaking fingers, usually mine." Dominic stared at her. The harsh daylight, streaming through the window, illuminated the pale, exhausted rings around her eyes. He had forgotten about her brother. He had forgotten she had a life outside of being his human white noise machine. "Give me the name of the bookie," Dominic said, his voice dropping into a dangerous, gravelly register. "I'll make a phone call. The debt disappears." Clara laughed. It was a dry, cynical sound that lacked any humor. "Right, and then I owe times you. I know how this works. I pay off a street thug by becoming indebted to a mafia boss. I'll pass. I have the cash. I just need to hand it over. You aren't leaving the estate on Thursday. Fire me then." She picked up her bucket and walked out of the office. Dominic watched the empty doorway, the muscles in his jaw clenching so hard, his teeth ached. He hated her stubbornness. He hated that she was right. Most of all, he hated the cold, terrifying sweat prickling at the back of his neck at the thought of a dark room, a ticking clock, and a brain tearing itself apart until dawn. Thursday came. Clara didn't show up for her shift. At 11:30 p.m., Dominic lay in his bed. The silence in the room was absolute, and it was deafening. The HVAC unit hummed, a mechanical drone that sounded like a dentist's drill in his skull. The shadows in the corners of the room began to elongate, twisting into familiar, grotesque shapes. The piano wire at the base of his neck pulled taut. By 1 a.m., he was sweating through his sheets, his blood thick with adrenaline and a feral, unreasoning panic. He threw the covers off, his bare feet hitting the cold hardwood. He didn't put on a coat. He just shoved his Sig Sauer into the waistband of his jeans, grabbed his car keys, and walked out. He didn't know where he was going to save her. He was going to save his sleep. The city at 2 a.m. smelled of rotting garbage, damp concrete, and exhaust fumes. Clara's neighborhood was a grid of crumbling brick walk-ups and flickering sodium streetlights. Dominic parked his Mercedes 2 blocks away, stepping out into the sticky, humid night. His head throbbed, a dull, rhythmic pounding behind his eyes. He didn't need to search long. He found her in an alley behind a defunct laundromat. She was backed against a chain-link fence, clutching a worn canvas tote bag to her chest. 2 men had her boxed in. One was broad and thick-necked, wearing a cheap leather jacket despite the heat. The other was wiry, nervous, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "The interest went up, Clara," the thick-necked man was saying, his voice a low, greasy rumble. "You're $2,000 short. Frankie says if you don't have the cash, we take collateral." He reached out, his heavy hand grabbing a fistful of her gray uniform. Clara didn't scream, but Dominic saw her flinch. It was a small, raw movement, a microscopic shrinking of her spine. Dominic didn't announce himself. He didn't make a heroic quip. He was operating on the pure, aggressive instinct of a man whose lifeline was being severed. He closed the distance in 5 long strides. The wiry man turned, his eyes widening in the dim light. Dominic didn't draw his gun. He didn't want the noise. He grabbed the wiry man by the back of the neck and drove his face forward, smashing it directly into the brick wall of the laundromat. The sound was a wet, heavy crunch, like a boot stepping on a hollow gourd. The man dropped like a stone. The thick-necked man let go of Clara, spinning around, his hand diving into his jacket for a weapon. Dominic didn't give him the time. He lunged, driving his shoulder into the man's chest, slamming him against the chain-link fence. The metal rattled violently. Dominic brought his knee up, burying it into the man's stomach. As the man doubled over, gasping for air, Dominic brought his elbow down on the back of his skull. The man collapsed in a heap of cheap leather and groans. Dominic stood over him, breathing heavily. The metallic tang of adrenaline coated his tongue. His knuckles were scraped, welling with thick drops of dark blood. He turned to look at Clara. He expected her to look relieved. He expected gratitude. Instead, Clara was pressed flat against the fence, her eyes wide, white-rimmed, and terrified. She wasn't looking at the men on the ground. She was looking at him. She wasn't looking at a wealthy employer. She was looking at a predator who had just, effortlessly, brutally, dismantled two human beings in a matter of seconds. The violence wasn't cinematic. It was ugly, fast, and entirely unhinged. "Clara," he said, his voice raspy. He took a step toward her. She flinched violently, raising her hands to protect her face. "Don't." The word was a choked, guttural sound. It hit Dominic harder than a bullet. He froze. The cold night air suddenly felt freezing against his damp skin. He looked down at his bloody knuckles, then back at her trembling frame. "Get in the car," he said softly, backing away to give her space. The drive back to the estate was silent. The air in the car was thick with the smell of old copper and Clara's sour, cold sweat. When they reached his bedroom, Dominic went straight to the adjoining bathroom, scrubbing his hands under scalding water until his skin was raw. When he walked back out, he expected the routine to resume. He climbed into bed, exhausted to the marrow of his bones. Clara sat in her chair in the corner, but the silence didn't come. Dominic closed his eyes, waiting for the steady, calming rhythm of her breathing. Instead, what he heard was a ragged, shallow rasp. He heard the subtle, frantic rustle of her uniform as she shivered. He heard the rapid, uneven thud of her pulse echoing in the quiet room. She was terrified. She was radiating fear, pumping nervous, jagged energy into the room. Dominic's eyes snapped open. The shadows in the corner were moving again. The ticking of the clock grew louder. The wire in his neck snapped taut. He couldn't sleep. The white noise was broken, corrupted by the reality of what he had done. He sat up in bed, running a hand through his hair. He looked at her. She was clutching her book, but she wasn't reading. She was staring blankly at the floor, her knuckles white. He couldn't just buy her presence anymore. He couldn't treat her like a piece of furniture. If he wanted the quiet, if he wanted the peace she brought, he had to fix the noise in her head. He had to cross the one boundary they had silently agreed never to touch. Dominic threw the blankets off and stood up. Clara flinched as he walked toward her, but she didn't run. He didn't tower over her. He dropped heavily to one knee in front of her chair, putting himself lower than her, an unnatural, vulnerable position for a man in his world. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, his voice a low, ragged whisper. Clara looked down at him, her gray eyes swimming with exhausted tears. She refused to let fall. "You kill people." "Yes," Dominic admitted, the truth hanging ugly and bare between them. "I do. But not you. Never you." He reached out, slowly, deliberately, giving her every chance to pull away. He took her trembling, cold hands in his warm ones. "I need you, Clara. Not your labor. You. I need you to be okay. Or, I'm not okay." Clara stared at his hands wrapped around hers, the rough calluses, the faded scars. The pulse in her wrist began, slowly, agonizingly, to decelerate. "Just breathe," Dominic whispered, anchoring his thumb against her pulse point. "Just breathe with me." And slowly, as the first gray light of dawn began to bleed through the heavy curtains, the frantic noise in the room finally began to fade. Thanks for watching the finale. Dominic and Clara's arrangement started as a desperate transaction, but survival has a way of blurring the lines between necessity and desire. Did Dominic truly change? Or is Clara just another addiction he can't let go of? Let me know your theories in the comments. If you enjoyed this dark, grounded romance, make sure to hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe for more intense, slow burn stories. See you next time.